Day 2 of the 2020 Hemispheric Security Conference. My name is Randy Pestana. I'm Assistant Director at the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. So we had a fantastic day 1. We had remarks from Southcom Commander Admiral Craig Fowler. We also had a panel led by the Perry Center, Lieutenant General Fred Rudesheim. We had a fantastic discussion yesterday, but we're going to keep up the momentum again today. Before we begin, I do want to shout out our partners for this year's conference, certainly United States Southern Command, the Perry Center, America Society, Council of the Americas, the Global Health Consortium, Carter Center, Universidad Nacional de La Plata, CREES, as well as the Wilson Center. I appreciate all your support and all your effort in helping us get the word out for this important discussion regarding security issues facing the Western Hemisphere. Today we have 2 panels lined up, but the first will be moderated by the great Miss Paula Garcia Tufro. She is Project Director and a member of USG Partnerships Policy and Strategy Team at United States Institute of Peace. Prior to joining the Institute, she was a Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin American Center. And she served from 2009 to 2017 in the Obama administration as a member of the National Security Council. So without much further ado, I turn it to Ms. Paula Garcia Tufro. Thanks, Paula.
Thanks so much, Randy. And thank you again to everyone who's joining us today for this discussion on the evolving security landscape in the hemisphere. We're delighted to have a distinguished panel with us today to lead us through this discussion. So let me start there by introducing our panel. I'll start with Mr. Juan Cruz, Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, also former Senior Director at the National Security Council, and the Director for covering the Western Hemisphere. We also have Dr. Rafael Fernandez de Castro, Director of the Center for U.S. Mexico Studies at the University of California, San Diego, and former Foreign Policy Advisor to President Felipe Calderón. Also joining us, we've got Farah Diva Urrutia, Secretary for Multidimensional Security at the Organization of American States. And last but not least, we've got Mr. Dan Restrepo, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress and also former Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere at the National Security Council. So again, just one more housekeeping note before we get started. I do want to remind our audience, we are taking questions, so I encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion. And encourage you to do so using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please do not use the chat box because that is not where we will be checking for questions. So again, encourage you to submit those as we go along. We will have an opportunity for a Q&A from the audience for about 30 minutes at the end of our moderated discussion. So with that, I just wanted to start with some brief opening remarks just to set the frame for the discussion. The region was facing difficult headwinds before the recent COVID pandemic, despite significant progress made in terms of the consolidation of democracy and protection of human rights over the last 3 decades. Despite that progress, violence, organized crime, corruption, and citizen securities continue to be significant challenges facing the region. In addition, the region is, as we know, facing its largest migration crisis in recent history. With the COVID pandemic, of course, only making these difficulties more pronounced and exacerbating the strain that it's putting on governments across the region as they seek to manage both the immediate health crisis and the longer term, both immediate, short, and longer term effects on their economies. And again, I would just add that obviously in the context of these tightened budgets and increased poverty, there's a risk that criminal organizations will take advantage of that opportunity, of an opportunity and step in to fill either the void where the governments are unable to meet citizens' needs or provide basic services. So those are some of the challenges. I also wanted to just refer back to some of the threats that Admiral Fowler referenced in his comments yesterday, which I think will be helpful to frame our discussion and will tee us up nicely to opening remarks from our panel. He cited 5 main challenges. The first is specifically on the young democracies and in some cases emerging weakness of some of the emerging institutions throughout the region. The second is corruption. and the degree to which corruption preys on those weak institutions. The third is transnational criminal organization, representing a $90 billion enterprise. And the fourth and fifth are related and refer to malign actors. First, malign actors external to the region, specifically citing Russia, Iran, and China, and we'll get to some of that in our discussion. And last but not least, malign actors within the region, and cited specifically Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. So again, we'll have an opportunity to talk through all of that. So with that, I want to turn it over to our distinguished panel and ask you each to spend 2 to 3 minutes just offering opening remarks. And specifically, if you could refer and provide your perspective in terms of what are some of the key and prevailing threats facing the region. So I'll start with you, Juan.
Okay, thank you, and good morning to everyone, and thanks to FIU for having us this panel discussing the evolving landscape and security landscape in the region. I think I'd take an opportunity first to discuss some of the issues in the region that we'll be facing in 2020 and beyond post-COVID that are new to us, new or have a different face to them since last year's conference. Admiral Fowler spoke about that, how last year, no one raised the issue of a pandemic, raging through the region, and yet here we are with a lot of follow-up weaknesses that'll ravage the region. But along with that are things like the environmental disaster that was taking place in Venezuela that took too long to be raised and discussed. The accompanying issue of illegal mining, which is not just Venezuela, but in other places in the region, and talk about international criminal organizations taking advantage of that. The social unrest and the demonstrations that were prevailing in the region before COVID, the COVID outbreak. And on one issue that it would be interesting to see how this, the response to COVID has arrested the social unrest, but is this restlessness going to continue when, measures get everyone back on the street? That's an interesting perspective worth discussing. And then one footnote that I would make on COVID is that, as the saying goes, don't let a good crisis go to waste. And I think the region had a missed opportunity when we saw COVID unfold in China and move its way slowly west. And instead of getting together and planning and taking precautions, we simply in the region watched this tsunami as it came towards us. And instead of heading for high ground, instead, all we did was brace and watch as it came over us. And instead, I would recommend that we should take an opportunity in the post-COVID world to get together, take an assessment, and see how in the region we can share resources among countries. We can share best practices, and we can share data so that whether it's a pandemic or any other crisis hitting the region, that we're in a better position. And I thought I'd end on that note. Thank you.
Thanks, Juan. Rafael, I'm going to turn over to you.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you very much for having me here. This is a wonderful opportunity to share with these distinguished panelists my thoughts about what's happening now. Let me start, Paula, by saying that I do believe that that we're living through the most important threat to humankind since World War II. I believe that at the international level, at the international or multilateral organizations level, we were not prepared for this threat, and less so at the national level. So let me say something about that. I believe that we will over-prepare, militarily speaking. I believe that since World War II, we over-prepare because we always thought that it was going to be a traditional threat. So I would say we have, instead of military expenditure, instead of military establishments, we were, again, over-prepared. I would say that 9/11 made some corrections because, yes, especially the US and few other countries, they prepare for non-traditional threats like international terrorism. But let's face it, 70 years after World War II, what we're facing is a health crisis that has basically disrupted the world in ways we haven't seen in 70 years. So I do believe that we really have to think in a paradigm change in terms of security. It's not about national security. It's not about, yes, this is a different threat. And I do believe that we really have to go to a more, I would say, comprehensive definition of security, and I believe that we should go back to classical definition of human security. We really have to take into consideration healthcare issues, nutritional issues. We have to really take care about educational issues. So I believe that, I mean, if you think in the G2, which is China and the US, these are the two countries that have been hardly hit by this COVID-19. So it seems to me that the lack of a safety net, both in China and the US, made them not very resistant to the current crisis. So we're talking about now the G0, and which there's international anarchy. So I do believe that we were not prepared, both at the international. The UN doesn't have the capacities, nor the other international institutions. So this is a time, I would say, to again, to rethink about our security. And let me just share with you another thought. I believe that in terms of, and this is more concrete, in U.S.-Mexican relations, we're seeing this dismantling of the institutional framework that we have built during the last 30 years or so. It has to do with Mr. Trump. I mean, he doesn't trust what they call the deep state. The same is happening in Mexico. Andrés Manuel López Obrador doesn't trust the deep state. So I do believe that we have to be very concerned about this dismantling of the institutions, of the regimes we have created for security cooperation. And let me stop here because you asked us for just introductory remarks, but these are my main two concerns. One, I would say, is global, and the other one has to do with the region and with this key partnership in the hemisphere, which is Mexico and the US.
Thank you for that. And I will just add, as a development practitioner, it's music to my ears to hear your call for a broader definition of what we, as we talk about security threats. So thank you for that. Farah, over to you.
Muchísimas gracias, Paula, por la oportunidad. La verdad que agradezco estar aquí para poder plantear la visión multilateral de lo que nosotros desde la Secretaría de Seguridad Multidimensional de la OEA estamos trabajando. Obviamente para nosotros la perspectiva es un poco más integral o multidimensional, porque no solo nos preocupa cómo la seguridad debilita nuestras jóvenes instituciones, sino cómo también le resta pues, posibilidades y atenta contra la calidad de vida que tienen nuestros ciudadanos. Obviamente nosotros llevamos un monitoreo de los desafíos de seguridad de la región y ya habíamos detectado una amplificación de los mismos. Obviamente ahora con el tema de la pandemia, pues nuestro temor es que muchos se han agravado e incluso diversificado en formas que nos van a acompañar de ahora en adelante. Pero desde la OEA la perspectiva más importante es que y lo que nosotros consideramos que es nuestra mayor preocupación son los altos índices de violencia. Somos consideradas la región más violenta del mundo porque tenemos la tasa de homicidios más alta del mundo, homicidio intencional. De hecho, contamos con los 4 países con la tasa de homicidio intencional más alta del mundo y obviamente esto está relacionado con todas los desafíos que ya han sido mencionados, es decir, la debilidad de las instituciones que da pie a la corrupción, el crimen organizado que se aprovecha de esta debilidad de las instituciones, el tráfico de drogas, el tráfico de armas, toda una espiral conectada. Además, esta debilidad de nuestras instituciones también lleva a que tengamos sistemas penitenciarios que no están cumpliendo su función. Y nuevamente lo que nosotros intentamos hacer desde la OEA es identificar estos retos, trabajar con los países y porque estamos convencidos de que de la mano de la seguridad, el desarrollo sostenible y la democracia podemos lograr pues más derechos para más gente, que es lo que reza nuestra institución y esa es nuestra perspectiva. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Farah. Dan, I'll let you close us out.
Excellent. Thank you, Paula. Thank you to our friends at FIU and to our fellow panelists. It's great to be with everybody, doing it virtually. I think that's kind of the way I try thinking about kind of the moment in time and the challenges that the region faces. I try simplifying things as much as I can and simplify it down to an acronym, to CGM. So C is the obvious one, is COVID-19, which has enormous health, security, political, economic consequences and implications for every country in the Western Hemisphere, for every country in the world, obviously. But particularly in the hemisphere, and particularly the largest countries in the hemisphere, and I think that's an interesting point that we should come back to. But it's also exposed, as it does in human beings, pre-existing conditions, pre-existing weaknesses. And one of those is a challenge that the region faced before COVID-19, or two challenges that the region faced before COVID-19. One is the governance challenge, a governance challenge of weak governing institutions in a number of countries, the undermining of democratic processes in almost every country in the Western Hemisphere, and I'm including the United States when I say that, over the course of the last few years. And again, in the big states, in the big federal republics of the Western Hemisphere, an undermining of democratic institutions and democratic processes that have real implications for the medium and long-term security and stability in the hemisphere. But also internationally, kind of a disjointed kind of share Juan's view that the region's kind of inability to respond as a region, the hemisphere's inability to get together as the threat was looming in February and in early March, I think underscores a challenge that already existed in terms of governance in the international space in the Western Hemisphere that I think is worth delving into. And then the M is migration. And the migration phenomenon, not just the Venezuelan migration phenomenon, obviously it's unprecedented in scale in the Western Hemisphere, but the migration challenges from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, and what was an interesting increase in Mexican migration that had long been down in the month or two before COVID-19 and before the practical closure of the U.S. Mexico border. Mexican migration had begun to tick up, which I think is something that has been underappreciated to date. So I think as you look at the landscape, you look at the horizon right now in the Western Hemisphere, COVID-19, governance challenges, that again, there was pre-existing skepticism or cynicism regarding the ability of democracies to deliver. And again, the abject failures in the three largest federal republics in the United States and Mexico and Brazil to respond meaningfully and effectively and in a science-based way to COVID-19, I think is going to underscore those challenges. And then the migratory phenomena that were underway that may be temporarily halted, but may come back with even kind of more interesting and more volatile dynamics than we saw prior to kind of this initial response to COVID. And with that, I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Great. So I thank you for all of you for your comments. I want to go back and kick us off by piggybacking on something that Farah raised with regard to the impact of the COVID pandemic on the region's fragile and democratic institutions in our region. I just want to talk about, we've obviously seen examples. We've seen examples in El Salvador. We certainly see it in Venezuela. We are seeing actions. We're seeing it in Nicaragua. We're seeing it in a number of different countries. So I just want to turn it back to all of you and just ask the question: to what extent do you expect that trend to continue, and more countries in the region to utilize the current context to really either crack down, whether it's on opposition, independent journalists, the spread of disinformation, just undermining core institutions as part of the response, and maybe to frame it slightly differently, to what extent are you optimistic that those emergency powers that many governments have acquired in the context of the current emergency will actually be handed back? and they will go back, which is obviously always a difficult task. But just want to gauge where are we in terms of level of optimism. What gives you, are there countries that give you most concern, or some that give you optimism in terms of that actually working out positively? So I don't know who wants to take that first. Dan, do you want to take a, or actually maybe Dan, start us off, and I'll turn it back to Farah since she made reference to this.
Terrific. So I think a couple of things. I mean, you cited kind of the most obvious examples in terms of the turn to authoritarianism. Actually, turn is not the word in Venezuela. They'd gone off the rails in democracy quite some time ago. I think Bukele's turn to authoritarianism, or to, borderline authoritarianism, I think is particularly worrisome. He is clearly one of those folks who is kind of quote unquote taking advantage of the COVID-19 moment to try, along lines that he was already pursuing, given his politics and the political situation of the country. But I think, and I'm going to harp on this, and I've already kind of commented on this, I think there's also kind of, it's not just these turns to authoritarianism that undermine democratic institutions. I think the fact that the three large federal republics in the Western Hemisphere, the United States, Mexico, and Brazil, are being led by folks who are actively putting out disinformation about COVID-19, who have continued to use COVID-19 to attack independent media and the free press and freedom of expression, is deeply troubling. So in that category, I put myself in the pessimist category in terms of, will we see those kinds of engagement with democratic institutions and democratic norms after COVID-19? I sincerely doubt it, because they didn't show a whole lot of commitment to those values before COVID-19. Again, this is exposing pre-existing conditions. And Trump, Bolsonaro, and López Obrador had a pre-existing condition with respect to a lack of respect for democratic institutions and democratic norms. And again, this kind of inability or unwillingness to be guided by science, to be guided by facts, to be guided by experts is troubling. And it'll have implications and impacts beyond these three countries, because these are the three largest economies. These are the three, population centers in the hemisphere. And this is a deeply troubling kind of assault on democratic norms that has intensified in some ways under the guise of response to COVID-19.
Thank you for that. Farah, I want to give you an opportunity to jump in here.
Sí, muchas gracias, Paula. Sí, definitivamente la Secretaría General de la OEA ya ha hecho su advertencia. Consideramos que es un desafío en nuestras instituciones tan débiles, la forma como se declaran los estados de emergencia. Obviamente va a haber un conflicto de intereses entre los derechos fundamentales que están siendo tutelados, pero siempre hacemos la advertencia y somos muy claros que aunque estemos hablando de la nueva normalidad, esta nueva normalidad es una situación temporal. Por tanto, estos estados de emergencia que pueden dar lugar pues, a cesación de autoritarismo o tienta al uso excesivo de la fuerza, también debe entenderse que debe acabar en cuanto la situación esté estable y los derechos fundamentales de los ciudadanos deben volver a ellos, ¿no? Entonces sí, desde luego estamos tomando una mirada muy cautelosa y advirtiendo a los gobiernos que es una situación temporal y que ellos deben regresar los derechos de los ciudadanos en el momento en que sea lo más pronto posible. Gracias.
Thank you. Rafael, I see you unmuted. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you, Paula. I agree with Dan. I mean, there's these preconditions in Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, Nicaragua, of course. But it would be interesting to think about perhaps the country in the region who has best react or act, perform vis-a-vis this crisis, which I will say is Costa Rica. What is what Costa Rica did well? I will say everything. So there's no silver bullet. What did Costa Rica has done well? Well, basically, they expend about 6% of Costa Rica GDP in healthcare issues. They have this very good, solid public health system in which even high middle classes, wealthy Costa Ricans, they prefer to go to have a major operation in this public hospital instead of a private hospital. That is very telling. I mean, that might be the case in Mexico when I was a little child, not anymore, that you will go to Seguro Social instead of going to a private hospital. So, and again, in Costa Rica, you saw a very good coordination of the executive branch and Congress. And then you also have the citizens of Costa Rica, they trust the government, they trust the health authorities. So this is very telling because I do believe that the countries who were weak in safety net, who were weak in governance, they suffer in this. And I wanted to showcase the example of Costa Rica because indeed there's way for Latin America to do things correctly, but we have to do it in a holistic fashion. Dan said that the Mexican migration is picking up. Not that much, Dan. What we've seen here in the border, it's Central American migration going down to the tops. On that, I will say COVID-19 has been the crown jewel of all these relentless efforts of the Trump administration to stop the Central Americans to come to the U.S. Mexico border. And not only that, but now there's no courts. So we don't have, there's no asylum processes going on now. So all Central Americans are sent back to Mexico in a hot pursuit. And we have about more than 60,000 Central Americans has been sent out, sent back to Mexico. So we have a big crisis in the Mexican border towns in Tijuana. Not so much in Tijuana because Tijuana is very well prepared for dealing with this, but it's very sad what is happening in Matamoros, in the east side of the U.S.-Mexican border, where you have campaments of about 2,000 immigrants, and you can tell that COVID-19 is badly hitting there. So this is a very complicated situation. And again, this is the crown jewel of the Trump administration, because when they shut down the border, March 20th, at that time, there were only 200 cases in Mexico and in Central America. In the US, there were 17,000. Now it's going to be different. There's going to be more cases, I would say, in Baja California. So I'm very worried about this continue to be the order of the game, a partially shut down border in which the porosity of Tijuana, San Diego is not anymore there. So we all are suffering because of this lack of porosity. And let me stop here.
Thanks, Rafael. I do want to piggyback on something and come back to you. So you referenced the specific case of Costa Rica, and going back to Farah's point about the need for greater coordination throughout the region, how concerned are you about the potential for spillover based on how Nicaragua is dealing with the COVID crisis?
Well, I will say, Nicaragua, we've been perhaps too attentive to Venezuela. And perhaps we've been a bit negligent about what's happening in Nicaragua. It's terrible what is happening in Nicaragua. We've been having a lot of migrants here in the border, especially in the last 2 years. A lot of students, a lot of parents with students fleeing from Nicaragua. Why? Well, because Ortega, the regime of Ortega, it really has become an abusive presidency. And so I do believe that we have to pay more attention into tiny Nicaragua and also about Venezuela. But again, these are the preconditioned states. So they have a window of opportunity to become more abusive. And I don't see an important answer, a regional answer, not to Nicaragua, not to Venezuela. It is very sad, but let's face it. Having the Bolsonaros, having López Obrador, who doesn't really care about world affair issues, about regional issues, it's very hard to put our act together. So this is a very difficult time in terms of coordination. I don't see that coming. I don't see the leadership, and it's very sad because this would have been the most important moment for our region to be well coordinated, and nowhere we're seeing that. And unfortunately, I don't see that either coming from the multilateral organizations.
Thank you for that. I want to pivot back to the migration crisis underway, which, you know, as Dan made reference to, you know, extends beyond, you know, the most prominent scale-wise migration of more than 5 million Venezuelans, but the threat that the ongoing migration crisis actually already pose on regional stability and security. And want to talk a little bit about what actions we can expect to see from governments across the region, and maybe to ask it in a way that doesn't, you know, more open-ended way. I want to tease out a little bit of what are the main risks you're tracking, what are the countries that give you the most, cause you the most concern in terms of their handling and what you expect to be their handling as countries really bear the brunt of the COVID pandemic. Again, everyone's at different stages in the epidemic. But certainly all are feeling the pain, and the economic pain will be long lasting in addition to the immediate health crisis. So Juan, I want to start with you, but then we'll open it up for others that want to jump in. Particular bright spots, places of a special concern that you're really watching for government actions.
Sure. This is a tough one, right? Because the whole Venezuelan migratory issue caught the region by surprise and quickly overstretched the capabilities of our countries to be able to provide the basic necessities and share social services, stretching the capabilities and, you know, in health and in education and so forth. So a lot of the countries reacted with new measures that controlled the flow and gave it some definition and made it tougher for the migrants to go from country to country. And we saw with that an incipient resentment in some populations, and especially some xenophobia emerging, especially early on in a place like Peru, and then incidents popcorning in Brazil and in Colombia. And I think most notably recently among populations along the Colombian-Venezuelan border, where people find themselves either out of work because it's just cheaper to hire a Venezuelan or something to that effect. Now, what that's done is, I mean, we can only imagine if there were a reason, a pretext really for greater resentment, God forbid, but, you know, maybe a hot zone emerging from the Venezuelan migrant community or, you know, some resurgent cases or cases coming back and forth from Venezuela. We can talk about that a little bit, but as we've seen some migratory movement now returning back, you know, back and forth, what does that do for the propagation of COVID? And that piece right there is interesting. Is this a short-term trend where we've seen a handful of people either repatriated to Venezuela or made their own way by land back into the country? Or and could this be a longer-term trend? What would happen if this population actually upon seeing the economic opportunities in the region shrink, find themselves in a trend returning home? I don't know what the answer is, but it's certainly interesting to note given some short-term trends in that direction.
Thanks, Juan. I want to pivot a little bit, staying with the pandemic, and then I promise we're going to get off of the pandemic and actually dig into some specific country-specific concerns. Just want to, again, also critical is the issue of the impact of the pandemic on organized crime and narco-trafficking operations throughout the region. So Farah, I want to start by turning to you to give us your assessment, what you're seeing from the OAS concerns, particular concerns that you've got and your perspective on the issue.
Muchísimas gracias. Sí, mira, nosotros estamos viendo, obviamente hay que verlo desde las dos perspectivas. En primer lugar, sí se afectó, hubo un impacto en la forma en que el crimen organizado y el narcotráfico ha desarrollado sus negocios. Entendamos que hay un cierre de fronteras, hay una restricción en el transporte aéreo, se ha cerrado la movilidad nocturna y la diversión nocturna. Todas esas eran 4 vías por las cuales el crimen organizado se manejaba, y esas 4 vías fueron cerradas. Lo que vemos entonces es cómo ellos han tenido que hacer una modificación de sus formas de hacer negocio, y también incluso han cambiado a otras áreas. Por ejemplo, inició de una forma masiva el tráfico de material sanitario falsificado, o hemos visto los anuncios de cómo los fraudes en el ciberespacio se han desarrollado de una manera más creativa. Entonces, obviamente para la OEA en materia de seguridad es un reto, porque tenemos que fortalecer entonces capacidades en los países en materia de ciberseguridad y en materia de identificación de productos falsos. Sin embargo, esa es una perspectiva, pero la otra también, y creo que lo mencionó antes quizás Rafael, es el tema de cómo el crimen organizado ha tomado una posición de algunos estados en lugares apartados donde el estado no llega porque está atendiendo los temas o está desbordado por el tema COVID. Entonces ellos son los que prestan la asistencia humanitaria, los que le dan alimentos, los que les brindan salud a estas personas de escasos recursos, y entonces ocupan la posición que debería estar ocupando el Estado. Entonces eso también incide en la debilitación de instituciones, y es algo que estamos viendo con ojos de atención, porque tenemos que trabajar en ello.
Thank you. Rafael, I want to give you a chance to weigh in as well. And again, I think maybe to pose it as a question, how do we do that, right? How do we actually get these governments to reclaim control over that perhaps was ceded in the context of this crisis?
Thank you, Paula. I mean, these are tough questions, but these are the questions that we have to think about. I like what Farah had to say about, about organized crime. What I will add to that is that I will say it's early to tell, Paula. I do believe that some Mexican cartels will better adjust than others. This is always the case, and we'll see which are the ones who will better adjust, and they will just become stronger. But I will say I'm very worried in Mexico and in Guatemala and in a few other places, Nicaragua as well, because there's an upsurge of gender violence that came before this crisis. In Mexico, we have had this series of femicides that is remembering us of what happened in Ciudad Juarez 10 years ago. So this is very sad. Remember that in Mexico, we had a very important march, or a very important protest last March 9th. We have Un Día Sin Mujeres, a day without women. And that was a protest organized by basically gender groups, because they say enough is enough. You gotta respect us, women. And unfortunately, the governor of López Obrador showed very little sensitivity to that. It's very hard to understand why a leftist government is not sensitive to that. Not only that, Paula, the López Obrador government is the one that in the Mexican history has had more women in government. Half of the cabinet, I mean, this is the government who decided to really give a boost to gender participation in this government. Nevertheless, they have done very little to improve, I will say, or to combat gender violence, and this is very concerning to me. Now we know that in the entire world, because of the quarantine, there's more violence within the families. So I believe that this is one of the aspects of violence in Latin America that has a shadow on it, and I believe, Paula, that we have to prioritize gender violence. We have prioritized these other violence that are not very well seen. And perhaps, I mean, we talk a lot about homicides because we have good statistics about homicides, very bad statistics about gender violence, awful statistics about extortion. So, I mean, the crisis hopefully will help us to get the right priorities in place, because we badly need this. And again, I'm very worried about what's happening in gender violence. Paula.
Thank you for that. I want to pivot a little bit and go back to the issue of criminal organizations taking advantage of the region's young and weak institutions, whereby an environment that is much more permissive to illicit activities is created. and talk a little bit about what are the actions that governments throughout the regions need to take, especially in the context of a pandemic and emergency situation where you're seeing new kinds of corruption emerging and new networks developing, be it in terms of the trafficking of medicines and siphoning off of critical emergency response equipment. So want to pivot, maybe turn to Dan and then let others jump in.
All right, let's see if my audio works, because there were issues with my audio before.
You're good.
Look, I think here you're right to point. There's a new challenge in COVID, right? Particularly governments are spending an enormous amount of money right now, and rightly so. They're pushing a lot of money out into the system, particularly as these preventive actions have been taken to lock down folks to prevent the spread of the disease. Governments have become the spender of first resort. There's got to be an enormous amount of transparency and accountability built into that spending. And that is true, again, starting in the United States where we don't have enough of it, but permeating throughout the region. It's vitally important that governments are transparent about how they're spending money at this time, given the levels of spending, and given the depth of corruption in a good number of the countries that are being hardest hit right now, and the concern of citizens of those countries, the well-founded concern of citizens of those countries, for their skepticism in their government's ability to not be corrupt and to provide fundamental services and time, and in good times and in bad times. So I think transparency is going to be the rule of the day. You've got, and this is a challenge when we're all stuck at home in terms of accountability from civil society as well, that civil society actors demand that kind of transparency from their governments, I think is going to be super important. And then there's this, unfortunately, the international community had played a very important role on corruption and accountability in the Americas. But the corrupt have pushed back, and have pushed back very hard and very successfully in places like Honduras and in Guatemala. That's an enormous setback for accountability and anti-corruption efforts in the Americas. The non-corrupt need to push back harder and need to make it clear that those kinds of institutions and that kind of institutional support from multilateral entities, be they formal multilateral entities or informal groupings of countries, to support accountability and transparency and anti-impunity efforts is fundamentally important moving forward. I actually think we also should think about something bigger than that in the Americas. Think about an anti-corruption commission akin to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. I think at a time it has come to think very big on transparency, accountability, and anti-corruption, and particularly as governments push this kind of money out into the system in response to COVID-19.
So you teed Farah up nicely to respond to your reference to the Inter-American system, so I'm going to hand it over to Farah.
Sí, efectivamente, para la OEA es una gran preocupación el tema de la corrupción. Para nosotros es la gran causante del retraso en el desarrollo de nuestros países, no solo porque vacía las arcas del Estado, sino porque también genera esta desconfianza en nuestras instituciones que al final del día hace que la democracia sea más inestable. Y obviamente, tal como dice Dan, los organismos internacionales jugamos un papel determinante. La OEA está comprometida en la lucha contra la corrupción. De hecho, tenemos un mecanismo que es el mecanismo de seguimiento de la Convención contra la Corrupción, en la que se hacen evaluaciones constantes a todos los países para ver su avance en temas de corrupción. También tenemos la Escuela de Gobierno, en el que continuamente estamos apoyando a los países para la transparencia en las contrataciones públicas, un sistema de gobierno abierto y la profesionalización de sus servidores públicos pero sobre todo nosotros también hemos trabajado con mecanismos contra la corrupción en El Salvador y Honduras, donde se han dado grandes pasos contra la corrupción. Así que sí es un compromiso, para nosotros es sumamente preocupante y haremos uso de todas las herramientas que tengamos en nuestras manos para apoyar a nuestros países para superar esta lacra.
Thank you, Farah. I want to pivot a little bit from this discussion, although I would say you both kind of alluded to it. I think part of the challenge is balancing all of the measures that you rightly have both pointed out that countries need to take and that multilateral organizations need to take in terms of transparency and accountability, and balancing that with the real need to get resources and support out to countries throughout the region. So that's obviously a challenge that we are all contending with as a global community, and our region is no exception. I want to pivot a bit to some specific bilateral issues and questions regarding some countries. And I want to start, Dan, I'll turn to you first on the U.S.-Colombia bilateral relationship, given Colombia's role as a strong U.S. strategic ally, largest recipient of U.S. longstanding largest recipient of U.S. assistance in the region. And again, without belaboring the specific point of the recent scandal, I do want to try to address what the potential impact of the recent scandal related to the legal wiretapping on political politicians and journalists and other human rights activists on the part of the intelligence services using U.S. procured equipment, what the impact that has on the bilateral relationship, and importantly, on the legitimacy of those very institutions in Colombia itself.
Let me start with the painfully obvious, right? It's completely unacceptable to use intelligence resources against civil society actors, journalists, in the manner alleged. And unfortunately, this isn't the first time that you've had this sort of example in Colombia over the course of the last 20, 30 years. Hopefully it'll be the last, but I'm grounded in reality. I think it's probably naive to think it'll be the last. In terms of its impact on the U.S.-Colombia relationship, I think to kind of broaden this out a little, the U.S.-Colombia relationship's had an interesting moment because Colombia itself is an interesting moment, right? Colombia lost its central organizing principle, kind of politically and socially, of the last 50 years, 60 years, with the formal end of the conflict with the FARC. And the country desperately needs kind of a new central narrative, a new forward-looking central narrative. And paradoxically, the recovery from COVID-19 may provide that opportunity, may provide something that is common cause in Colombia that is forward-looking rather than backward-looking. Before COVID-19, and even somewhat during COVID-19, kind of political discourse in Colombia is backward-looking. It's still kind of relitigating how the conflict ended. And that's not particularly useful, and it's not particularly useful to the U.S.-Colombia relationship moving forward. There is a decreasing bandwidth and interest in international affairs in the city that I sit in at the moment, in Washington, D.C. That is true, certainly of this administration, but I think it's true of the body politic. I think it is true of both parties. Colombia benefited from an enormous amount of the time and attention in officialdom in Washington. It is, Plan Colombia and the Colombia turnaround story was a bipartisan success story in the narrative in Washington. But the folks who did that have moved along. The folks who understand what Colombia was in 2002 versus what Colombia is in 2020 have largely moved along. And unless Colombia can find its new narrative, find its new role, and part of that, and it still has strategic value for the United States, given where it is situated, given the depth of the relationships that were built during these past 20 years. But if the country itself continues to muddle along without a purpose and without a common cause, I think that, more than a particular intelligence community scandal, is going to be detrimental to the U.S.-Colombia relationship moving forward.
And I just want to ask one follow-up question, and maybe Juan, feel free to jump in as well. To what extent are you concerned about the current scandal and the kind of pattern of recurring scandals in this space to lead to a revisiting, a hard look within the U.S. Congress and within the U.S. policy establishment at that relationship and specifically at the resources allocated to that bilateral relationship?
I'll be real quick and then I'll turn over to Juan. I mean, I think it'll influence it. There's another process that I'm actually involved in as a commissioner of the Western Hemisphere Drug Policy Commission, which was set up a couple of years ago by Congress to look at U.S. counter-narcotic policy in the Western Hemisphere writ large, largely over the course of the last 20, 30 years. We have a report due out in November, bipartisan commission. I think there is an appetite to relook at what has worked, what hasn't worked. And obviously, a central piece of that narrative is Colombia and the counter-narcotics, to the extent U.S. policy can be considered a success on counter-narcotics in the Western Hemisphere or not. Again, I think those kinds of relooks and those kinds of questions, more than a particularized scandal, are going to influence the path forward for the relationship.
Juan?
Yeah, I would caution that we not overreact. The issue of I heard the word recurring, and I've seen it, that concern in the press. What I would point to is I don't know how recurrent it is. We have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The Colombians are doing exactly what we want the Colombians to do, to detect, quickly address it, and order an investigation, and going back 10 years. And I think the last time something like this happened of this magnitude was probably 10 years ago, which is, I don't know how recurrent that is, but it's not an example unique to Colombia. I would offer that sometimes people practice bad behavior even in our own country with warrantless wiretaps and that sort of thing. So it happens. It's unfortunate. It's not right, and the Colombians are doing the right thing about it. I would say also that we have to be careful in trying to dictate too much what we want to come out of this. The story that's lost is not the one entity that practiced bad behavior and excessive measures outside the law. It's the dozens that haven't, right? It's all those units in Colombia that are doing the right thing that won't get the right spotlight, and that it will come out during the investigation that hopefully that one or two were bad behavior, but it's not endemic, and that's something that's not worth the concern of the U.S. people, the U.S. Congress, or the way that we provide assistance to our best friends.
Thank you for that. I want to pivot to Mexico. I want to go back to Rafael and some of the issues you raised regarding the rise in crime. Farah alluded to them as well, and as in terms of number of homicides, particularly in Mexico in 2019. And also add the element of the proliferation of armed and criminal groups in Mexico. So I'm gonna open the door wide open for you to comment about your level of concern about these trend lines in Mexico, and then ask for your thoughts in terms of where the President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's focus should be in terms of trying to mitigate and prevent the further proliferation and wrap his arms around the proliferation and militarization of these groups in the context of this growing competition between different criminal gangs in Mexico. So doors wide open. Rafael, over to you.
Thank you, Paula. I would say goodwill is not enough. Just to talk about corruption, I do believe that Andrés Manuel López Obrador has a very legitimate priority of combating corruption in Mexico. And he had basically two priorities: combating corruption, and the second one is to close the gap of distribution of wealth. Very important throughout Latin America. So he got it right. I mean, his heart was on the right issues. Unfortunately, we don't see that important results. He has been really unable to put together an economic package to try to lessen the cost of COVID-19 in the Mexican economy. So that, and why is he doing that? Well, because he's perhaps thinking too much in the past. In all of those where he sees bailouts of the wealthy people, of the banks, and so he doesn't want to go back to that. So that's very worrisome. his relationship with the private sector, his relationship with, I will say, with technocrats, is not good at all, so it's very sad to observe that he has good intentions, and Mexico, the Mexicans are suffering because of good intentions are not enough. Thinking about the crime situation and the violence in Mexico, yes, last year we saw the worst year ever in Mexico in terms of homicide. It was very bad, and what we haven't seen yet in Mexico, it's a comprehensive strategy about how to go about and diminish violence. It's unfortunately what we've seen with López Obrador is that he's blaming Calderón, my former boss, and he is blaming Peña Nieto. And yes, they did important mistakes, but what is the new strategy? We don't know. So it's and then he's now basically going back to the old recipes, and he has said that yes, the army will continue to be in charge of public security, which this is very sad, because this is stopping the very important reforms that we have to do. I will say that what is going to happen still is hard to tell, but he has not come with a comprehensive strategy. He's been trying to essay new ideas like, well, we don't going to continue to do this war against cartels, which is fine to me, but again, he's missing a comprehensive strategy. But in terms of bilateral cooperation, I believe that this is very telling, because he and Trump, they get along very well. They like each other. They respect each other. And López Obrador said just a few weeks ago that he wanted to come to Washington, his first ever trip as president, to pay his respects to Mr. Trump, because Trump has been very helpful to us in terms of the pandemic. I don't think it's that way. The U.S. cannot really help Mexico because the U.S. is in need of help. But I would say, if the question here, Paula, would be, does that goodwill between the presidents translate into something? And I would say yes and no. Yes, because yes, we were able to renegotiate NAFTA successfully, and hopefully the new agreement will go into effect sometime in the summer. This is very important for the Mexican economy and very important for North America. But I would say it's not been that important in terms of, I would say in terms of migration, border issues. What we have had is a blunt unilateralism that we haven't seen in decades. And what we have is a Mexican president who has decided to do not confront Mr. Trump. That is his decision. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it is not. I believe that we have to have our own border policy, our own immigration policy. And I will stop with this. President López Obrador, at the outset of his administration, he basically told Central Americans, you're welcome to Mexico. You're welcome to transit through Mexico. Well, they came. They were invited to come, and they came. And then down the road, in late May 2019, when the Border Patrol caught 150,000 people, they were apprehended in the U.S. Mexican border, Trump said, enough is enough. And then they basically created this, they were already created, the migration protection protocols, by which every single Central America will be sent back to Mexico to wait for the asylum process. This is something that is causing a lot of disruption in the U.S.-Mexican border. We have this humanitarian crisis in the Mexican side of the border since the caravans came in late 2018. So I will say that and under the current crisis, what we have, we only have a worsening of the situation here. And I will invite you to come see the border, see how, the huge humanitarian crisis that we have there. Because let's face it, for example, all the shelters in migrant shelters in Tijuana, they basically been helped throughout the years with a lot of goodwill from California. Now, those volunteers coming from California cannot come. Now those good food and shippings from California are not coming anymore. So this is a very difficult situation in the border. And I will say already it have these preconditions that now are really exploding under this COVID-19.
Thank you for that. And we may have time to come back to this, and Juan, Dan would be interested in getting your response to the extent to which, especially in the context of COVID, there's opportunities to actually translate that goodwill into something, right? And what are some of those opportunities, and what could the U.S. do as part of a COVID response to help put some meat behind that goodwill. I do want to, I'd be remiss if we didn't get to Venezuela. There are some questions, but surprisingly not all about Venezuela coming from our audience. So I'm going to take a few minutes for us to talk about Venezuela. Just for, again, as I referenced at the top, Admiral Farah in his remarks yesterday certainly cited Venezuela as a place where many of his top 5 threats applied. So you've got weak institutions, you've got corruption, you've got foreign actors external to the region. You've got foreign actors internal to the region. You've got certainly extensive transnational criminal organizations' presence and actions in country. So with that frame, I want to start specifically on the external actors. Widely documented and extensively documented in terms of Russia, Cuba, and China's engagement in Venezuela. Noteworthy in the last week has been the increased engagement on the part of Iran. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about that, and turn it over. Maybe I'll start. I'll start with you, Juan, and ask you about your level of concern regarding Iran's engagement, and talk a little bit about where their interests lie and how concerned we should be about that increased engagement.
Well, as we look at Iran and Iran's engagement, it's made perfectly for their foreign policy. For a small investment, they get to stick their thumb in the eye of the U.S. And they played this piece over the gasoline with Venezuela brilliantly. First of all, they go in and sell the Venezuelans all sorts of equipment and knowledge to try to resurrect this moribund gasoline refinery, something that neither the Russians nor Chinese were able to do because of the neglect, a long time neglect by the regime in that refinery. So they come in, they sell millions and millions of dollars worth of equipment. God only knows if it'll ever start functioning, but probably not. And then on top of that, they get to sell them the gasoline anyway. So so it's a double whammy. It's brilliant on their part. They get to sell both, and then in addition to all this, they get to stick a thumb in the eye of the United States. My concern with Iran is very limited. I don't like to overstate it because it's very convenient to do so. People play around with it, and it's like a boogeyman. When you want people to get nervous, you pull out, Iran. But the truth is that if we wanted to be concerned about Iran in the region, Iran and Venezuela, we should have done so 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when Chavez, it was the Chavez policy that invited the Iranians into the region, that ushered them into relationships with other countries. It was the height of, diplomatic agreements, military agreements, so-called training and selling of equipment. And yet, we did little at the time. And then today, here we are 15 years later, and we really want to exploit it. I'd say let's be careful. Clearly, the Iranians are there. Clearly, the Iranians play a role, but we need to right size our worries. And right now, where we're going to cross swords is over this. I guess in 2 days. Let's see, the Iranian, the Fortune is supposed to enter the region maybe today, and enter the Caribbean today, and expected in Venezuela 2 days from now. So that'll provide an opportunity if we decide to step aside and let them go through, or if we decide to confront them. And Admiral Fowler's words give us an expectation that probably confrontation won't be the way forward, but maybe it will be anyway. You know, maybe the situation pushes that in that direction. So that's the only piece that would worry me in the short term. I think that concerns with Iran are real, but they tend to be overstated.
Thank you for that. I want to come back to something you said, because you said they took, you know, they got a low investment, huge payoff on the part of Iran, you know, brilliant move in that sense. I want to contrast that, right? How feasible, especially in the context of post-COVID, right? Contrast that with the U.S. maximum pressure campaign, and the degree to which that's worsening the situation on the ground, right? The U.S. is not currently in a position where it would have been consistent with that policy to come in and assist with the gas, to address the gasoline crisis. So how much more difficult does that U.S. position become, and how much more difficult is it to sustain when faced with other actors who are coming in and filling in the gaps and addressing some of the most pressing needs of the day?
The United States has placed pressure in other areas of the world as the Venezuelans tried to buy gasoline, make sure that they're not violating sanctions. And so that's where you end up buying gasoline from the Iranians rather than on another market. I also point out to the fact that that maximum pressure doesn't mean, as the regime's propaganda insists, that it denies them the opportunity to buy food and medicine. That's a self-inflicted gunshot wound on the regime, and we have to be careful not to play into that propaganda. There's nothing in the sanctions, you know, they're deliberate attempts to stay clear of that. That's not what the U.S. is about, but it's the incompetence of the regime and also their determination to use what income they have to line their own pockets and spend money elsewhere and not on medicine and food. So we have to be very careful not to fall into that narrative that they've very carefully orchestrated. And on the gasoline piece, just that, you know, again, that's a self-inflicted gunshot wound. You know, the reason that they can't refine gasoline is because they're terrible at managing these things, and they let one of their areas of industry collapse. And so that someone else can step in there and substitute it, I think there's going to be a lot of reticence to do that. And U.S. pressure on Repsol in the last 2 days is a good example of that.
Thank you for that. I want to pivot a little bit to the recent naval counter-narcotic mobilization in the Caribbean and talk about how that mobilization has impacted narco-trafficking operations in the region and transit routes. How is that shifting the landscape and the risks faced by the region, in particular in the Caribbean, but also its effects in terms of the ultimate destination countries and flow of drugs to those countries. Farah, I want to maybe turn to you first.
Bueno, definitivamente, como hemos dicho, la situación alrededor de la pandemia ha cambiado la forma de actividad del narcotráfico y de cómo los grupos organizados se desarrollan en su normalidad. Pero también lo que ha demostrado es que ellos tienen una gran capacidad de modificar sus formas de trabajo. Lo cierto es que aun cuando se ha hecho este desplazamiento en el Caribe para poder evitar que sigan sus rutas normales, lo cierto es que ya existía un abastecimiento de las sustancias ilícitas y eso ha permitido que el mercado siga, pero ellos inmediatamente buscan otros objetivos, ya no van por mar, pero van por tierra. Recordemos que también los estamentos de seguridad están en estos momentos más ligados a contener la movilización, a aplanar la curva de la epidemia. Entonces ellos buscan esos recursos limitados que también tiene el gobierno y que está invirtiendo, porque son los estamentos de seguridad los que en estos momentos se están encargando de contener la pandemia. Y obviamente vuelve y deja vacíos y grietas donde la delincuencia organizada transnacional se aprovecha y utiliza entonces esas nuevas rutas, intentando pues superar aquellos, por ejemplo, si no puede usar la ruta marítima o la ruta aérea, pues está buscando rutas terrestres que puedan estar desamparadas porque los estamentos de seguridad están enfocados en contener la pandemia.
Thank you. Dan, I want to give you a chance to jump in here as well.
Yeah, I think a couple of things are important to keep in mind. And it's been quite some time since I've had access to classified information. But the primary transit, or a great deal of the illicit product that ends up in U.S. markets transits through the Eastern Pacific. And the administration, I think, has played up the Caribbean aspect of this for a completely unrelated reason. And that's a political reason. The current administration has a political policy towards Venezuela that is intended to excite and elicit votes from folks who live not far from where we would all be sitting, but for COVID-19. Folks who live in South Florida. And it is very much a targeted electoral policy that is designed to create false expectations of change among Venezuelan Americans, that all options are on the table, that if we were behind this, bizarro mini Bay of Pigs, we would have been successful. But we weren't directly involved, tells us Secretary Pompeo. So this is part of a broader message that long ago was about, ceased to be about the Venezuelan people, right? This was about the Venezuelan people. You'd have temporary protected status in the United States for tens of thousands of Venezuelans, actually more than that, Venezuelans who are in an undocumented position in the United States at the moment. You'd have more cooperation on the humanitarian assistance to our to our partners in the region to deal with migratory outflows. You'd have a coherent policy rather than a set of talking points, and an attempt to create this impression of pressure. And this counter-narcotics deployment is an interesting example. Again, this was a deployment both to the Caribbean and to the Eastern Pacific. There are sensible operational reasons for doing that. It's going to be successful if it is a persistent presence. And what has not been answered is, will these deployments last past November 3rd, right? Or will, somehow these assets no longer be necessary after November 3rd, which is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, in an even numbered year. And I think we can't lose that thread when we think about what we're doing. Greater interdiction in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, I'm all for it. Is it a persistence presence? Is it creating results? Have we seen an uptick in interdiction? Have we seen the uptick in interdiction in the Eastern Pacific, or have we seen it in the Caribbean? My guess would be in the Eastern Pacific, because there's more product flowing through the Eastern Pacific. And so you're going to find more product and you're going to interdict more product. So I think it's wrong-headed to use U.S. military assets for political purposes. And it's not in the U.S. long, medium, or short-term interest to create false expectations about what the U.S. is or is not willing to do to effectuate political change in Venezuela. And to be perfectly clear, this is a regime that has failed in all of the ways that Juan Cruz talked about, that has long since given up governing the country or worrying about the Venezuelan people, and has been all about lining its own pockets and maintaining itself in power. But both, let's stop playing politics with this and start putting national interest first. And unfortunately, you see very little signs of that.
Thank you all. I want to turn to the questions that have been coming in, and I've been combing through them as we've gone along with the discussion. We'll try to get through as many of them as we can. I'll jump around to different topics. One question related to the pandemic. There's a question of how concerned are you about the potential for rogue states to weaponize, be it COVID-19, Ebola, or another virus in our hemisphere? So I want to open it up. Rafael?
Yeah, but before to go to that, Paula, let me take an issue with interdiction. You know, when I hear and I think about the concept of interdiction, it really, I mean, this belongs to the 20th century. This is traditional. This is something that is not helping us at all, that we have wasted enormous resources on this. This is part of the establishment that we have to rethink nowadays. Seems to me that what we need, we Latin Americans, it's safe streets for our children. So instead of thinking about interdiction, we should be thinking about how can we come with much stronger law enforcement institutions. And what is what we can do to improve our police departments? What is what we can do to increase the safety net of Latin American cities and towns and states? And what are the programs that we could have for youth? I mean, how can we have youth inclusion? So I hope, Paula, that this awful crisis that we're living through will help us to put our priorities in order. Unfortunately, we don't have, I don't think that we have the actors in place. And this is why this is very sad, because now we have at the State Department, I mean, let's face it, I mean, the secretary himself is someone who is not really thinking about Latin America, less so about the well-being of Latin Americans. I believe that the State Department was finally going into the right direction. For example, the Merit Initiative had become very decentralized. They were helping during the last 2 or 3 years. They were putting a lot of resources in developing capacities in Mexican local governments, which I believe that's right. That's what we need. Important efforts in develop social capital in local governments. So I'm just want to say, Paula, that I, again, every single crisis should create opportunities. This is an opportunity to put the right emphasis. Let's face it, Latin America is in the midst of this awful violent crisis. Farah said so. I mean, we have, we're only 8% of the world's population, and we're monopolizing close to 35% of homicide in the world. That cannot be, that shouldn't be our region. And I believe that we must encourage the US and Canada to be part of this conversation, to move the focus of our attention. And we have to have the citizen, the individual in the middle. It's about citizen security. It's not about national security. It's in California. Now I live in California. I have been, I mean, so here, marijuana is legal, and still you have a lot of problems, a lot of cash for Mexican cartels dealing with marijuana. I believe that we have to have a concerted effort to shift gears, to create new priorities, to have, for example, something that is badly needed in Latin America is a prison reform. And the US is not a place to go, because you have a big problem in the US. So it's, again, I hope this crisis should give us an opportunity to rethink the entire process. And that's why I get annoyed with concepts like interdiction. Sorry to say that, but this is how I started, and I believe that we're losing the war against the cartels. We're losing that traditional war, and it's because we have. I mean, we don't fight in the right war. So again, let's. I don't know what Farah thinks and what Juan and Dan think about this, but I believe we need a radical change in focus, and I believe that the idea is to have nowadays the human being at the center of this and think about differently about security.
So I want to give some of you a chance to respond. I'm also mindful of, I want to get through some of these other questions. So I'll ask you to be brief in your response, and then what I'll do is I'll batch 2 or 3 questions together and let you each take pieces of the question. So Farah.
Sí, solo muy breve quería comentar que obviamente la política de la OEA, tal como dice Rafael, es poner a las personas en el centro de la situación. y por muchos años se estaba viendo quizás el narcotráfico bajo una perspectiva de seguridad. Obviamente esa perspectiva ha cambiado a una perspectiva de salud. Sin embargo, quiero también hacer la advertencia que desde la OEA hemos estado dando seguimiento a estas amenazas que pueden catalogarse entre el grupo de bioseguridad sí, de bioseguridad específicamente, y ya la OEA tiene un programa específico que había tomado en cuenta la alta mortalidad de la pasada crisis H1N1 para crear este nuevo programa, y este nuevo programa está en efecto en estos momentos, y nuestro mayor interés es crear esas capacidades que ya están demostradas que carecemos, y crear estas capacidades en los Estados miembros para combatir no solo esta pandemia, sino futuras pandemias o futuras quizás amenazas en materia de bioseguridad en la región. Así que estamos en ello, estamos trabajando en ello desde el Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo, y generaremos esas fortalezas y capacidades en los Estados miembros.
Thank you. So I'll throw out three questions. I'll go back to the one, but I will answer the first one and get you guys off the hook. On the weaponizing COVID, Ebola by rogue states, I think the focus has long been at looking, to the extent that we look at health risks as the potential for them to be weaponized. And there's been less focus on all the preventive measures and investments that we need to make to actually protect us from the situation we find ourselves today, which is a natural, organic transmission of a virus versus the weaponization of that virus. So we'll take that off the table. I'll give you two more. One of our audience members asked about the role of military, seeing the changing roles of militaries throughout our region in the context of COVID. Do we need to rethink their role in the face of changing challenges throughout our region? The second one relates to the gang's role in enforcement of lockdown in many countries, and what effect that has on the long-term power that these groups have in society. And then I will, well, let's start there. I don't know who wants to go first.
Paula, if
Rafael.
There's two countries in the world that have done, I would say, fairly well containing the COVID-19 crisis are Germany and Costa Rica. You know what they have in common? They don't have an army. It's very telling. They have an important safety net. So seems to me that I mean, we have to get lessons from these countries. There's something they have done well, and for example, the way the federal government in Germany cooperate with the states is very good. It's exemplary, and it's basically the federal government is the sum of all the different states. So that's that they offer a very important example to us. There was a question there about open borders. I will say no, the US should implement the law, but I will say the US is not implementing the law because the US, I mean, there's a right for world citizens to ask for asylum, and we don't have that happening now. And I'm very worried because migration course has been closed for the last 2 months. And so we have a very important backlog there. And we know there's bad violence in Central America. There's awful violence in Guerrero, Mexico, in Tamaulipas, Mexico. So that's awful. Then there's some other questions about, I mean, yes, the fragmentations of cartels. I mean, I would say, yes, there's been a lot of abuses against migrants in transit. A lot of those Central Americans sent back to Mexico, especially in Tamaulipas, especially in Eastern Mexico. There's been bad abuses. They have to be sometimes shipped down to Monterrey, Nuevo León, all the way to Tapachula, to the Mexican southern border with Guatemala. So I will say there's what we need is better coordination. What we should avoid is unilateralism. I I believe that Mexico and the US could do better in managing our borders. We have done it in the past, and it's very unfortunate that at this time of crisis, we're not really talking to each other. Mexico is basically accepting the US conditions, but again, I by all means, I'm referring to open borders and to do not obey the US law. No, the US law should be respected, and that's why I'm worried about not having immigration courts here, because what we have seen is that what is open are the Mexican merchandise to come into the US. But that's unfair, because those asylum petitioners, I mean, they have the right to do. But let me stop here.
Thank you. And you did part of my job for me, because you jumped ahead to some of the other questions, so appreciate that. I do want to pose a few others. Maybe Juan and Dan ask you to jump in on this one. I'll reframe it a little bit. The question was around the degree to which some countries in the region are looking at the Chinese model of social control as an example, and how big of a concern that is for you.
Paula, I'm going to start with the end of the last question, if that's okay, because I have a decidedly different view. I think that we should applaud our military in the region. During COVID, they've stepped up to do the most difficult things. Much of our military has been vilified and held accountable for things that happened generations before the ones that live today, and that they've been in the eye of the storm, exposed to the very worst of this, and then being the ones that we rely on not only for enforcement, but to go out there and help the people that are most affected and distribute food and water and other things. And so the military has, I think, regained some of that appreciation and recognition in the region. Countries where that stands out are, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Brazil, and other places. And so we have to be very careful not to set aside the important role of the military has in a non-combatant role. And even in Mexico has a long tradition of the military stepping up during natural disasters and being a life preserver for the population there. So I would be remiss if I didn't have a comment on that. And I'm sorry, what was about China? I think that China has been highly discredited over their behavior. Let's remind ourselves that the whole thing starts off in China, that it was the opaque nature of their reaction and the concealing of numbers, and still they haven't come clean, that they've tried aggressively to correct through their diplomacy, propaganda, and other measures, trying to for their own record to mold and ply and reconstruct a record on this. It's atrocious, and I don't think that China is a model for anything in the region. I think that, in fact, they've lost credibility over their actions, and they're coming in now from behind in some countries, making donations and that sort of thing. But the fact is, it's too little, too late, and I wouldn't worry too much. I think China's taken it on the chin, rightfully so, on behavior in the region.
Thank you for that. So I want to give you all a chance. Dan, if you would, I'm going to have you guys go to your wrap up. I want to give you a lightning round. Keep it to under a minute because we're running short on time. So 30 seconds each for any final comments you may have. Dan, feel free to use it to comment on this question or to add your final comment, and we'll wrap up. So Dan, I'll start with you.
Certainly. I just want to pick up on something that I had said earlier, and I couldn't agree more that even from a U.S. national security interest, if folks across the Americas feel safer in their homes and in their communities, that is fundamentally good for the U.S. national security interest in the Americas. And U.S. policy should center citizen security throughout the region. We shouldn't think we're going to solve public health problems in the United States, which is largely the use of illegal drugs in the United States, in coca fields in the Andes, or in transit zones. But we should focus on being a force for good for citizen security and for accountability and transparency and support for democratic governance throughout the region. If we do that, we advance U.S. national security interests in a way that certainly hasn't been the case over the course of the last few years.
Thank you. Farah, over to you again. If you could keep your comments brief so we can stay on schedule and I don't get myself in trouble with the event organizers.
Sí, claro. 3 ideas claves que quiero dejar en el tablero es, en primer lugar, la importancia de tener políticas de seguridad trabajadas, basadas en evidencia, y que esas políticas de seguridad incluyan la perspectiva de género, súper importante. Como la OEA, obviamente, desde una perspectiva multidimensional, integral, pone a la persona, al ciudadano, delante de esas políticas, es para nosotros clave. Y en tercer lugar, quiero exhortarlos a que cualquier pregunta desde luego estamos abiertos a recibir opiniones. Tenemos un portal post-COVID, Buscando un Mundo Mejor, y queremos que todos participen, tanto la academia, la sociedad civil como los ciudadanos, y los exhortamos a que nos comuniquen sus pensamientos. Y muchas gracias.
Gracias, Farah. Rafael, de vuelta, si puede ser breve en sus comentarios.
Claro que sí. First of all, I want to say that you should, Paula, you're a wonderful anchor woman. You should think about go to CNN or a place like that. You've been doing wonderful. Congratulations. I will say this crisis should allow us, or should, to rethink priorities. And I will say priorities shouldn't be on the military establishment, and it should be on safety networks. That's it.
Thank you. Love the brevity. Juan, you get the final word.
Thank you. I'd say that I'd like to also congratulate you for a very good job, especially Venezuela tends to dominate these discussions and suck all the oxygen out of the room. You did a great job in balancing it with so many other topics. Our region is rich. It's rich in topics. It's rich in possibilities and opportunities. Unfortunately, the U.S. historically has a crisis-oriented foreign policy to the region. Well, guess what? We're going to enter into a special era of crisis. And so let's take that as an opportunity. We have an incredible, a tremendous capability to self-heal in the region, but this one we can't do alone. So I hope that our administrations, whichever one it is, steps up and helps in the healing process.
On that really optimistic note, I want to thank all of you for your perspectives, for joining us today. I want to thank our organizers at FIU for the partnership and for having all of us here. And I want to thank our audience for listening in. Apologies for being 1 minute over. Randy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Paula. I appreciate your exceptional work. I echo the sentiments of the panelists. You were exceptional moderators. So thank you for joining us. Juan, Dan, Farah, Rafael, thank you for everything and for supporting in this effort. Some notes for our audience. I encourage you to follow us on social media, Gordon Institute and FIU LAC, and hashtag HSC 2020. You'll be able to see the traffic throughout our conversation throughout this week. So please follow us on social media. This is also a good time to plug some work that Gordon Institute and LAC did together, looking at Latin America and the Caribbean 2030. So doing a look ahead towards what the region might look like in 2030 and what that means for the hemisphere as a whole. So those can be found on gordoninstitute.fiu.edu or at lac.fiu.edu. Now we will turn to a break. We have 30 minutes before our next panel looking at women in peace and security with Ambassador Jean Maines. So you will have to refresh your browser or go visit us at go.fiu.edu/HSC 2020. Thank you all for an exceptional panel. Thank you all for joining us, and look forward to seeing you at 1 o'clock.